This weekend was the Laughing Dragons MXP event in the Bay Area, highlighted by a massive 8-slot modern RCQ with $20,000 in prizes that attracted almost 300 players to start off the 2024-2025 season with qualification right away. There were tons of different decks in the room, and 8 different archetypes ended up in the top 8 with a unique over 60 card main deck, under 15 card sideboard Yawgmoth deck piloted by Jennifer Wang, tanking down the whole event. With 74 different archetypes in the room, this event had a lot to break down, so let's get started. As always, I just want to mention some house cleaning before we jump into the numbers. I am using Melee's website to gather the results that MXP tracked on their website. There were 291 reported players with only 288 deck lists, so that means that 3 players do not have lists assigned to them on the platform. All the numbers you'll see will be using that 291 number for total decks to do the math, but I can assign correct wins and losses for deck archetypes that I don't have. That just means that if one of these players had a popular deck, it won't be reflected in their overall win-loss, and it won't be affected in the matchup matrices. So with the fine print out of the way, let's take a look at the metagame at Cal Palace from a high-level perspective. How many of each deck were in the room? Since Modern tends to be a format of pet decks and older decks that people tend to just update with a couple of cards along the way, I'm going to start with the decks that only had a single copy in the room, which is a lot. There were 42 archetypes that only had one pilot playing them, which includes some slight tweaks on other deck lists such as Golgari Scam or Azoirus Mill, but also has some unique deck archetypes such as Neobrand or Vampire Pox. That leaves 33 decks that had multiple copies in the room, with 8 different archetypes having 2 copies floating around the room, 4 different archetypes with 3 copies being shuffled at tables, and 3 archetypes with 4 copies being played across the event floor. So at the end of the day, we wind up with 17 decks having 5 or more copies at MXP, making up 70.5% of the overall decks, with format favorites like Yawgmoth, Domain Zoo, Rakdos Scam, Esper Goryos, and Amulet Titan being the top 5 decks in the room. I think the top end of the deck shook out somewhat to expectations. Tron and Murktide were also popular choices, with Murktide losing a couple points in metagame share by splitting between Izzet lists and Temur lists with Pick Your Poison and sometimes Questing Druid. 5-color Creativity was played in decent numbers, although less than I thought it would be after looking at the results from LMS Prague last month, although that may be due to lists cutting down to just Jund colors instead. Azorius Control with Kaheera as the companion also had a good number of decks, while the new hotness Temur Prowess showed up with almost double-digit decks thanks to Slick Shot Show-Off being as good as it is popular at the moment. 2 types of mono black decks differed by Carnboard with Cabal Coffers or Scam Package topped the metagame share, while Domain Rhinos and 4-color Omnath still had enough decks in the room to be mentioned. We're going to focus on that just over 70% of decks that had at least 5 copies in the room for the next little bit of our analysis, as this will give us a more zoomed in feel for the modern metagame. We're going to look at their win rates in addition to their popularity tier, which, if you haven't seen from the last video, is calculated based on the number of archetypes present in the room, and then how many of each of those archetypes there were, and seeing where they fall on the normal distribution curve. Basically, how popular a deck is compared to all the others, and then we put how successful it was right next to it. Yawgmoth was not only the most popular deck, but also put up a solid win rate for having so many copies in the room. While not the highest, being over 50% while playing the most matches goes to show how powerful the deck is right now. The same can't be said about Domain Zoo, however, which had 5 less decks but a 6.6 percentage point difference in win rate compared to Yawgmoth, putting the deck under that 50% win rate. Rakdos Scam, Esper Goryos, and Amulet Titan all weren't as popular as these other 2 decks, but put up good results for being the second tier of popularity at MXP. Esper Goryo specifically had a very successful event overall, having the highest win rate of any of the double-digit number of decks. Meanwhile, Mono Green Tron continued to have a downslide in the metagame by putting up a very unfortunate 35.5% win rate at MXP. While Tron will always have some pilots in the room no matter the state of the deck, it's a little disheartening to see the mainstay fall so far down the meta. Meanwhile, other perennial popular deck choice Izzet Murktide cracked above a 50% win rate, showing the deck still has some legs despite its Temur cousin only putting up a 42.9% win rate. Both versions of Creativity did pretty well, with Jund Creativity having one of the 5 highest win rates at the entire event. Temur Prowess also did well with a 54.5% win rate, showing that the new deck has the speed to compete. Unfortunately for our slower, more controlling decks, both Azorius Control and 4-color Omnath had subpar weekends, with Omnath falling below a 40% win rate. Both versions of the mono black decks had very similar win rates, which means we'll have to take individual matchups into account to really see which would be the better call at the moment, while the Domain Rhinos quietly put up good results again at MXP, despite Domain Zoo being the go-to 5-color deck. Boros Burn rounds out the top played decks with a below average 42.9% win rate, meaning an over 10 percentage point difference between it and the other fast deck in the room, Temur Prowess, could see a shift in how pilots approach a quick spell-based damage strategy in Modern. While those were the most played decks and how they did, this event did have its fair share of spicy lists. So with so many one-of lists at the event, let's take a look at the highest win rate decks regardless of how many pilots played them. Azoirus Mill made not only top 8, but the top spot in win rate at MXP this weekend, subbing out the normal Dimir spell package of removal for a control-esque strategy based around the famous pair of Mill Crabs and Teferi Time Raveler, while packing Supreme Verdict, Solitude, Prismatic Ending, and the One Ring to stall out long enough to deck opponents with Archive Traps and Jace Perfected Mind. One copy of Mono Black Midrange, which fit neither the Cabal Coffers nor Grief Scam kind of build of the list, was actually the best performing Mono Black deck in the room, also making top 8 on the back of just a solid mid-range black card pile with Bowmasters, Shieldred, Rings, and Profane Tutor. We even got main deck Liliana of the Veil to make Reduke proud. Another one of the top 8 decks, Temur Breach, married the normal fair breach strategy of the Izzet shell powered by Underworld Breach with the green sideboard options of Pick Your Poison and Veil of Summer to ensure it could bolt somebody down to lethal. A 5-color combo deck in air quotes featuring the Urza-Thopter-Sword combo also had a very high win rate, maybe due in part to how many different things were going on in its list, most of which that could just be fetched by using Warrior of Invention. As mentioned earlier, Jund Creativity had a 61.9% win rate and settled 5th on the overall win rate list with 6 copies of the deck in the room. Golgari Scam, which actually didn't feature any main deck endurance, saw 1 copy at a 61.5% win rate with just a good stuff deck list, while the Izzet cousin of top 8 Breach deck and Zoo Scam saw similar win rates. Now the Zoo Scam list was pretty much Domain Zoo, but with some of the slots taken out and dedicated to the Grief Scam package as we've seen at Prague. Bant Hammer, which splashed for Pick Your Poison, had 4 copies in the room at a 60.5% win rate, while the Izzet version of Prowess actually had a higher win rate than Temur with fewer copies in the room. Overall, this breakdown of decks led to 1,990 matches of Magic the Gathering being played over the weekend, which gives us a rich amount of data to pull from to look at the head-to-head matchups between decks. Because of the size and the scope of just the number of decks that were played in the tournament, I'm going to zoom in even closer to just the top 10 most played decks in the room and how they matched up head-to-head. This will not only keep the video a little bit shorter, but it will also give you the more accurate picture as to what to expect if you hop onto a Magic the Gathering online league or if you go to Modern Night at your local game store. Last video, I did include the full matrix in my comments down below, but I saw that less than 20 people actually checked it out according to my viewer counts on the document. So if this is something you're interested in for future videos to look at all the different deck archetypes just with a little drop down menu and a Google sheet, let me know in the comments below and I'll make sure to clean up my data and pass it out. Golgari Yawgmoth topped the popularity charts and still put up a show win rate rise, as it did end up the winning deck of the entire event. Always a great choice into decks that are looking to win via combat damage, Yawgmoth put up great results against Zoo and Prowess, while also boasting a high win rate against Scam, but stumbling a bit against Azorius control. Some of the decks trying to go bigger than it, like Creativity and Tron, were pretty good matchups for Yawgmoth, while others like Amulet Titan and Esper Goryos ended up being a little too fast and a little too big for Yawg to handle. Interestingly, it was Izzet Murktide that gave the roughest games from the top decks for Yawgmoth, which basically switched from what Prog just a month ago told us, where Murktide was the one struggling, and Creativity did that well. Prog had more players, so a larger sample size than what we have here at MXP, so I wouldn't read too far into it since lists haven't changed all too much. Yawgmoth's popularity alone makes it something you'll have to prepare to play against, while its matchups solidify that it is a strong choice for Modern right now. Domain Zoo was the talk of the town just under a month ago, and still showed up with an army of Scions and the second most decks in the room. However, the deck showed a bit of vulnerability this time around, with losing matchups into Yawgmoth, Esper Goryos, Amulet Titan, Tron, and Control. Decks that could either avoid or shut down its game plan entirely were expectedly difficult for the deck to take down. Scam, Murktide, Creativity, and Prowess were easier for the deck to wind up battling. Now of note, this does group together these blue Zoo decks that look like Zoo-Murktide hybrids with the more creature-centric traditional Zoo lists, so when you're selecting your Zoo choice, choose wisely. The normal Zoo package ended at a high of 18th place at 9-4-0, while the blue Zoo variety peaked at 23rd with an 8-4-1 record. If this divergence does keep up, we'll have to look to split Zoo between the blue, Scam, and normal archetypes in the future just to get more accurate results. Rakdos Scam is still hanging in there as not just a popular deck, but a winning one. Scam is especially good at combating the combo-based decks like Esper Goryos, Amulet Titan, Tron, and some of the Creativity lists. Turns out, it's hard to put your pieces together when you've discarded two of them at the start of the game. Scam isn't the machine it used to be against more aggressive decks though, as it struggled against Yawgmoth, Zoo, and now the new Prowess decks without catch-all answer like Fury provided. The one matchup to note here is the extremely low win rate against Izzet Murktide again. With 6 matches played, it's not the most data in the world. This is a stark contrast to the more 50-50, even maybe slightly Scam-favored matchup that we've come to expect. With no real card changes between these decks, I can only really chalk this one up to pilot skill matchup, but I'll have to keep my eyes on it just in case Murktide players have figured out something, because selfishly, I'm the Scam pilot here and I need to learn. Esper Goryos had another pretty solid event as it continued to attack the upper tiers as far as popularity goes, smoking Domain Zoo with an almost 73% win rate and scoring just over 60% win rate against Yawgmoth. Control and Prowess were also good matchups for the deck, as taking a Gristlebrand or a Troxa from the graveyard as fast as turn 2 or 3 can be too much for those decks to handle. The list wasn't invincible though, continuing to struggle against decks like Scam and Creativity that were able to stall it out long enough to do their own game-winning thing. Tron was also a matchup that saw Esper Goryos slightly on the losing end, as the deck was playing more Karn Liberated again to give the deck many different ways to exile a big reanimated creature. Amulet Titan continues to see high win rates and decent representation at modern events, sailing over any of the decks that couldn't interact with its pieces early enough. That means any deck running the Grief Scam package was an issue, as well as some of the 5-color Creativity lists running cards like Mana Tithe and Reprieve to slow down the deck long enough to get Archoned. It did perform better at MXP against the Esper Goryos list than previous events, but there hasn't been a ton of iteration on the matchup to point to a specific reason for the 50-50 matchup spread here. Of note, there are a small number of lists starting to main deck a copy of Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, over just sideboarding it in later, which does help against Atroxa, Solitude, and Archon entering, but it won't do much versus Gristlebrand or an attacking Archon. Mono Green Tron brought back some tools it was known for having, such as Karn Liberated at MXP, but it wasn't enough to liberate the deck from a low win rate overall. Struggling against decks that disrupted it, went under it, and in some cases even went over it, which sounds like a lot, Tron is in a spot in the metagame where despite having a lot of tools to deal with things, it still falls victim to doing them somewhat inconsistently. Cards like Karn and Ulamog are great at exiling away single or multiple threats, but when a deck are curving Grief Scam into Atraxa, suddenly the Tron deck doing one strong thing isn't enough to beat multiple of them from the opposing deck. This is amplified in matchups against decks like Yawgmoth, where the entire deck is built to synergize with a line of play, whereas Tron tends to try to win on the back of the strength of its payoffs alone. Izzet Murktide took the title back as the most played Murktide deck at MXP from its Temur cousin that was all the buzz at Prague just about a month ago. The lack of pick your poison was for sure felt in the Domain Zoo and Esper Goryo's matchups, but with a field of less scions and a little more variety, Murktide was able to shine a bit brighter. The biggest difference for Murktide at this event was this absurdly high 80% win rate against the most played deck in the room, Yawgmoth, with the highest of all the top presence decks win rate in this head-to-head matchup. While nothing really seems to have changed deck-wise for these two, pilots on the Izzet side of MXP seem to have something figured out with that matchup. A good Scam matchup also helped put Murktide towards the top of the standings here for win rate, even if it still has struggles against the rising amount of creativity decks. And speaking of those creativity decks, the 5-color version of the deck was played less at MXP than I thought it might be, although it seems to have some pretty unfavorable matchups, so maybe that's a good reason why. Not the best into Yawgmoth on paper, the deck struggled even more this weekend across its 5 matches played versus the Golgari deck. However, the deck did well against Esper Goryos and Tron to keep its win rate pretty high. In fact, the creativity list is fairly consistent overall, with a 53.1% win rate against the top decks in the room, and a 52.6% win rate against the rest of the field at MXP. I still think that the white splash of those sort of taxing counter magic effects makes the deck operate much smoother in a violent outburst free metagame, and expect to see this deck continue to rise in popularity as Modern continues to see more play. Azorius Control had a weekend that saw it jump to a C in popularity, but still had a few struggles in the dub department. The deck seemed to do fine into the 2 S-tier popularity decks, which were Yawgmoth and Domain Zoo, but much like the other decks in Modern, fell prey to any deck running the Grief Scam package. The deck split its matchups between the top decks in the field, but had similar win rates against both sides of the room. I think the deck was hoping to thrive in an environment where more people played the top 2 decks, even though 21.7% of the room is already a lot. I just think the control deck ended up seeing the other parts of the meta instead of the ones they prepared to face. Of note, it also saw 0 matchups against Tron, which was the other struggling top presence deck in the room, so it couldn't even bolster its stats there. Last but very not least is the new-ish kid on the block, Temur Prowess. Slickshot Show Off did not have the hottest performance against the most played decks in the room, struggling to find wins against both Yawgmoth and Domain Zoo. It also struggled to beat up on Esper Goryos, as you may expect, a bird wizard might not beat a Phyrexian Angel or incredibly powerful Demon Lord that easily. The deck did, however, punish many of the other decks in the room with its combination of speed and redundancy thanks to adding some copies of Underworld Breach. Being fast enough that Scam couldn't stop it is already pretty impressive, but the deck was also fast enough to sail under Titan and Tron with a 100% win rate against the 2 green decks in a small number of matches. Even against the field, the deck saw a 58.9% win rate, which shows that not a lot of decks could keep up with how fast it was going. So that's what Modern looked like at Cal Palace this past weekend. There's a ton of decks that performed well out there, so it's really up to your preference or the card you own already as to which you want to choose to play. With the metagame so wide open, it's really hard to pick sort of a best deck, even though a lot of people have really settled on Yawgmoth given the deck's popularity. However, I am going to go a little counter to the popular opinion and say that my breakout deck for the event, due to its win rate and its matchup spread, is the same as it was in Prague: Esper Goryos. While Scam is still pretty popular and a not great matchup for the deck, the decline of decks like Tron and the surprisingly slow adaptation back to creativity in the meta means that Esper Goryos matches up extremely well into the list that you'd be most likely to see at a local event or online. Because of that angle of attack that it has on the metagame snapshot at this specific moment, it's the deck I'd choose if I wanted to hop into playing right now. So, what do you think about my breakout deck or about MXP in general? Did we see enough changes with the release of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, or were you hoping for a little bit more of a shakeup? And what about the decks overall? Are you leaning towards one or another as your favorite, or are you in that spicy list corner cooking up a new brew? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to thumbs up the video while you're down there if you've enjoyed it. As always, tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on more deck techs, metagame analysis on events just like this, and in general, Magic content. See you later.